They did not kill him quickly. The executioners made sure of that. In a barren courtyard under a grey afternoon sky, Spanish soldiers pinned a Dutch rebel to the wooden scaffold. His wrists and ankles were bound so tightly he couldn't even wipe the cold sweat from his eyes. A heavy iron pot was lowered onto his bare abdomen. Inside it, something alive scratched and squealed. When the brazier was lit on top of the pot, a new kind of horror began. The man's muffled cries turned to shrieks as starving rats, driven by heat and hunger, began to gnaw their way into his stomach. Around the scaffold, onlookers cringed and clutched their mouths. But the soldiers of the Duke of Alba did not flinch. This was exactly the message they wanted to send. This was the fate of Pieter, a simple tradesman-turned-rebel in the Dutch Revolt. He wasn't a lord or a famous general, just one of the many who dared to defy the Spanish crown. Yet his death in agony was staged as a public spectacle, meant to burn itself into the memories of all who saw it. Under the reign of the Duke of Alba, 1567 to 1573, such cruelty was no accident. It was policy. Pieter's gruesome end was intended to be a lesson to anyone dreaming of rebellion. And as we'll see, it was one of the darkest chapters in a war already filled with nightmare scenes. What led to this horrific moment, and why would men resort to such monstrosity? To understand that, we must step back to the beginning of Alba's terror and the desperate rebellion of the Dutch. In the 1560s, the Low Countries, today's Netherlands and Belgium, were in turmoil. A growing number of Dutch citizens had embraced Protestant ideas, especially Calvinism, in defiance of their Catholic Spanish king, Philip II. Tensions hit a breaking point in 1566, when bands of Protestants rampaged through churches, smashing Catholic icons in an outburst called the Iconoclastic Fury. The Spanish authorities were furious and alarmed. Philip II decided to make an example of the Netherlands. He would stamp out heresy and rebellion with an iron fist. For this task, he sent Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the third Duke of Alba, to take control. The Duke of Alba arrived in 1567 with an army of Spanish tercios and immediately established a special tribunal to punish anyone suspected of disloyalty or Protestant faith. This court, officially called the Council of Troubles, soon earned a more sinister nickname, the Council of Blood. Its proceedings were swift and merciless. In just a few years, the council condemned thousands of people to death for treason or heresy. About 1,000 were actually executed, by hanging, beheading, burning, or worse, and many more were flogged or imprisoned. Others fled into exile to escape death. Alba's regime confiscated the property of the condemned and even arrested officials who protested his brutal measures. It truly was a reign of terror. The Duke's methods were not only judicial, he used the Spanish army to terrorize the population. When some towns dared to resist his authority, Alba's forces slaughtered inhabitants as a warning to others. The names of those towns would be seared into Dutch memory. Zutphen, Mechelen, Naarden, each suffered a bloody Spanish fury. In Zutphen, Spanish troops hunted down rebels and citizens alike, executing hundreds, dumping some bodies in the river. At Naarden, after the town surrendered, the Spanish gathered the townsfolk in a church under pretense of peace, then butchered nearly everyone inside and burned the town. Smoke and screams drifted over the marshes, as only a handful of survivors stumbled away to tell the tale. These atrocities sent a clear message from the Duke of Alba: this is the price of rebellion. It wasn't only commoners who suffered. Alba infamously executed two revered noblemen, the Counts of Egmont and Hoorn, in Brussels in 1568 for supporting the resistance. Their public beheadings shocked Europe. These were men of high birth and loyal service, now bloodily dispatched in the grand square before a hushed crowd. That act turned many previously loyal subjects against Spain. It also eliminated moderates who might have brokered peace. The net was cast wide. Anyone, high or low, who opposed King Philip's rule or clung to Protestant faith was in danger. The Dutch people began to view Alba as a cruel tyrant, a boogeyman who drank the blood of the innocents in their land. Mothers frightened unruly children by whispering, "Hush now, or the Duke of Alba will come for you." Against this backdrop, William of Orange, also known as William the Silent, emerged as the figurehead of Dutch resistance. Once a loyal stadtholder for the king, William had broken with Philip II over the persecution of Protestants. He fled abroad just ahead of Alba's arrival. A lucky escape, as Alba surely would have executed him. From exile, William raised armies and encouraged the Dutch to resist. His rebel followers, nicknamed the Beggars, struck back at Spanish rule. In April 1572, rebel privateers seized the port of Brielle, a victory that electrified the Netherlands. Town after town in the provinces of Holland and Zeeland rose up and declared for Orange. The flames of revolt were lit. Alba, enraged and determined to snuff out this uprising, struck back ferociously. Spanish columns marched to retake rebel-held towns, and reprisals were brutal. This is the world in which our doomed rebel, Pieter, found himself. Alba intended to terrorize the Dutch into submission by any means necessary, and torture was one of his weapons. Indeed, stories spread of captives being broken on the wheel, stretched on the rack, or having their tongues and hands cut off as punishment for defiance. In some cases, the goal was to extract information about rebel plans. In others, pure public intimidation. It was said that Duke Alba himself boasted of executing 18,000 people during his tenure. An exaggeration, perhaps, but it captured the nightmarish reputation of his rule. Under this shadow of fur, every Dutch rebel knew that capture meant a fate worse than death. Yet the cruelty was not one-sided. This bitter conflict pushed some of the Dutch rebels to answer atrocity with atrocity. Rebel warlords, too, sometimes used grisly tortures on their Spanish enemies or suspected collaborators. For instance, one of William of Orange's own commanders, Diederik Sonoy, was rumored to torture captured Catholic loyalists by the same terrible method we witnessed at the start. He would trap rats on a prisoner's belly under a bowl and heat it, forcing the frantic creatures to gnaw into the victim's bowels to escape. In a war fueled by religious hatred and revenge, mercy was in short supply. This was the world of horror that Pieter stepped into when he joined the rebellion. A world where being caught by the enemy could unleash human imagination at its worst. Who was Pieter, and what did he do to deserve such a gruesome end? Pieter was an ordinary man swept up in extraordinary times. A blacksmith by trade from a small town in Holland, he had lived quietly until the war reached his doorstep. In early 1572, inspired by William of Orange's call to resist tyranny, Pieter helped form a local band of rebels. They swore to fight for their faith. He had secretly become a Protestant, and for the ancient rights of their town against the Spanish oppressor. Pieter wasn't a notorious outlaw or a great military leader. He was simply a father and a husband who had had enough of living in fear. His acts of rebellion started small. He and his compatriots would sabotage Spanish supplies, ferry messages between rebel cities, and hide wanted dissenters from Alba's soldiers. Pieter became particularly good at smuggling letters. He carried communications from William of Orange's agents, moving under cover of night from one safe house to another through marshes and woods. Each time he slipped past a Spanish patrol, his confidence grew. In those secret letters, he read words of hope. William promised relief, foreign support, and freedom of religion once the Spanish were driven out. Pieter dared to dream that his children might see that day. But Alba's spies were everywhere. One fateful evening, Pieter's luck ran out. Betrayal struck a fellow townsman, perhaps under torture or hoping for a reward, revealed Pieter's identity as a rebel courier. As Pieter returned to his village with letters concealed in his boot soles, Spanish soldiers were waiting in the dark. He had barely stepped through his own doorway when boots thudded on the threshold. They came for him, torches, drawn swords, and the red and yellow uniforms of the hated Spanish tercios. Pieter's wife screamed as they seized him, and his children clung to his legs until soldiers pried them off. The commander dumped out Pieter's boots and found the hidden letters, sealed with William of Orange's emblem. This was enough to seal Pieter's fate. He was dragged in chains to the nearest fortress, a stronghold flying the banner of the Duke of Alba. There, Pieter was thrown into a cold dungeon, accused of treason and heresy. His captors mocked him as he shivered in the dark. "You wanted William's freedom? You'll die William's death instead." Within a day, he was brought before the Council of Blood, or rather, a traveling tribunal of Alba's officers and inquisitors. The trial was perfunctory. Pieter was not a nobleman with any chance of mercy. He was just one of countless common folk condemned in batches. There was no advocate to defend him. A clerk read out the charges: rebellion against His Majesty, blasphemy and heresy for forsaking the Catholic faith, and assisting the enemy, William of Orange. Pieter tried to speak, perhaps to plead for his family's safety if not his own, but a guard struck him in the stomach with a pike end, silencing him with a gasp of pain. The judges needed no further evidence. The letters he carried were proof enough, and Pieter himself was a known agitator in his village. The verdict: death. That was a foregone conclusion, but the manner of death, that was something carefully chosen. In most cases, captured rebels might be swiftly executed by hanging or firing squad. But Alba's regime had started to realize that simple executions were not stemming the tide of unrest. The rebellion still raged on, fueled by outrage at Spanish brutality. To truly cow the people, Alba thought, he needed to make examples that would haunt the mind. So for Pieter, the authorities devised a special punishment, one meant to be spoken of in terrified whispers across the Netherlands. They would turn nature itself into an instrument of terror. As Pieter awaited his sentence in the dungeon, he heard the screams of others echoing in the halls. Some prisoners were being tortured for information. The crack of bones on the rack or the sizzle of hot irons on flesh provided a ghastly soundtrack to his last night alive. Perhaps an interrogator even visited Pieter, showing him the devices in the torchlight and asking if he had any last secrets to confess. Pieter had none to give that they didn't already know. In truth, his execution wasn't about extracting intelligence, it was about sending a message of dread. Before dawn, his sentence was announced to the town. The rebel Pieter would die that very day, and all citizens were required to attend. A forced audience, gathered to witness what happens to those who defy the king. Mothers, fathers, and children were driven at pike point into the square of the fortress courtyard. The atmosphere was tense and terrified. Spanish soldiers formed a ring of steel around the edges to ensure no one left early, and perhaps to prevent any rescue attempt. Some of Pieter's neighbors and family were in the crowd, including, heartbreakingly, his wife, Johanna. She had been kept alive only to watch the brutal fate of her husband, so that her despair might echo through the community. The cruelty was calculated at every level. Under a bleak morning sky, Pieter was marched out to the scaffold in the courtyard. He was pale and bruised from his rough handling, but he walked on his own feet. The guards had not maimed him. They needed him fully conscious for what was to come. His hands were bound in front of him, and his shirt had been torn away, exposing his bare torso to the chill air. Villagers murmured in confusion. This was not the normal posture for a hanging or beheading. Instead of a noose or an axe, they saw the soldiers bring forward a metal pot, a sack wriggling with rats, and a heap of charcoal and firewood. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as they realized something truly diabolical was about to happen. Two Spanish soldiers forced Pieter to lie down on a wooden table that had been erected as a platform. They tied him down tightly, ropes across his arms, chest and legs, rendering him completely immobile. Pieter's chest heaved in panic. He had heard rumors of this torture, but perhaps never believed humans could really inflict such a thing. Now he knew they could. He started shouting, whether in prayer or desperation. No one could tell, because it quickly became an incoherent scream. "Please, in God's name, just kill me." His captors only laughed. In the front row of onlookers, some women were already sobbing and turning away, unable to watch. But the Duke of Alba's magistrate supervising the execution barked an order. "All eyes open. This is justice. Let every traitor witness what befalls the king's enemies." At the magistrate's nod, a soldier pulled a large starved rat out of the sack with thick leather gloves. The creature writhed and snapped, famished and wild. The rat was shoved under the inverted iron pot placed on Pieter's abdomen. Another soldier quickly slid a heavy stone on top of the pot, ensuring it could not be toppled or moved from within. In the sudden silence, you could hear Pieter's frantic breathing. He couldn't see the rat under the pot, but he could feel it, the scratching of claws on his bare skin and the flick of its naked tail on his side. He bucked against his restraints in pure terror. Then the executioners brought the fire. They heaped glowing charcoal onto the iron pot's flat bottom and added a few fresh coals from a brazier, causing a plume of sparks to swirl upward. The pot began to heat almost immediately. Inside, the rat would have felt the temperature climbing, the metal growing hot against its feet. Pieter felt it too, a spreading warmth on his belly, turning quickly to searing heat. He let out a cry, "No, no, no," which dissolved into a scream as the pain of scorching metal on skin hit him. But for the torturers, that pain was merely a tool to intensify the rat's desperation. For a few heartbeats, nothing more happened. Those watching might have thought this method oddly quiet, compared to a chopping block or gallows. They could only hear Pieter's whimpering and the crackle of coals. Some might have hoped the torture wouldn't truly work. Perhaps the rat would just die from the heat. But rats are survivors, and this one was fighting for its life. Suddenly, Pieter's body jerked violently against the ropes. His eyes bulged, and a howl erupted from his throat so raw and primal that it scarcely sounded human. It was the rat. It had begun to bite. Unable to escape upward due to the hot iron, the rat had found the only soft, yielding way out, into Pieter's flesh. The creature's teeth sank into the man's abdomen, clawing and chewing frantically. Pieter screamed and bucked, but the soldiers held the pot firmly in place, pressing it down to keep the rat trapped against him. Blood started to trickle out from under the rim, staining the wood boards red. Gasps of horror and disgust rippled through the crowd. Many could not bear to look, but the soldiers shoved them back into position if they tried to turn away. "Watch!" the magistrate commanded harshly. "Watch and remember!" Inside the pot, the rat tunneled ferociously. It tore through skin and muscle in a frenzy to flee the burning heat above. Pieter's screams reached a new pitch when the animal gnawed into his intestines. A woman in the audience fainted at the grotesque sight of a bulge writhing under the skin of his belly, as if some hellish parasite were devouring him from within. With one last convulsion, Pieter let out a strangled cry, and then a wet, gurgling sound as blood bubbled from his lips. The rat had pierced something vital. The ropes creaked as his body contorted in agony. The soldiers stepped back finally, removing the coals. When they cautiously lifted the pot, they revealed a scene from a nightmare. The rat, muzzle crimson, emerging from a gaping bloody hole in Pieter's abdomen, slick entrails hanging from its teeth. Pieter himself was mercifully near death or already gone, his eyes glassy and wide with final terror. But the punishment was not over yet. Shockingly, the magistrate ordered the process to be repeated on another rebel prisoner, one of Pieter's comrades captured alongside him. This young man, barely older than a boy, had been forced to watch Pieter's torment up close as a preview of his own fate. Now when soldiers tried to drag him forward, he collapsed to his knees, sobbing and begging for mercy, offering to convert, to serve in the Spanish army, anything to be spared. There was no mercy to be had. The crowd, already nauseated, had to witness the same appalling ritual again. Another starved rat, another heating pot, another round of unearthly screams. If anything, the second victim's end was even more excruciating. Forewarned of what was coming, his mind broke before the rat ever touched his skin. He wailed and babbled prayers until pain robbed him of sanity. By the time the rats had literally eaten their way out of the two rebels' bodies, an eerie silence had fallen over the courtyard. The only sounds were the crackling of dying embers and the faint, satisfied squeaks of the sated rats. The Spanish officials surveyed the crowd with grim satisfaction. The spectacle of living men being devoured from within had rendered the onlookers ashen-faced and retching. Terror had been implanted deep in their hearts. That was the goal. As the bodies of Pieter and his friend were untied and discarded into a cart, the Duke of Alba's men announced to the trembling townsfolk, "Thus perish all enemies of the king. Go and tell your children what you saw here." It was a scene straight out of hell, and for the people forced to watch, it would be a waking nightmare that haunted their dreams for years to come. The immediate aftermath of this gruesome spectacle was one of shell-shocked horror. The crowd dispersed slowly in stunned silence or muffled sobs. Families clung tightly to each other. Many could not get the image of Pieter's fate out of their minds. The screaming, the blood, the awful reality that human beings had done this to one of their own. In the days that followed, the town was eerily quiet. Fear hung in the air. Neighbors eyed each other warily, wondering who might betray whom next, or what other horrors the Spanish might unleash if provoked. Some people burned any rebel pamphlets or William's proclamations they had hidden, terrified that even a scrap of seditious paper could lead them to the torture table. Alba's strategy of intimidation seemed, at first, to be working. Rebellion in that area went dormant. No one dared rise up immediately after witnessing such brutality. Word of Pieter's dreadful death spread quickly beyond the fortress walls. Rumors flew from village to village, growing ever more dramatic in the retelling. Soon, all across the Netherlands, people were whispering about the rebel who was eaten alive by rats. Many dismissed it as too horrific to be true, just a ghastly tale to frighten children. But others, especially those who had seen it firsthand, swore it was the truth. These stories achieved exactly what the Duke of Alba intended: sheer terror. In some towns, rebel sympathizers lost their nerve, afraid that if they were caught, they too might face such unspeakable torment. A few local leaders who had secretly supported William of Orange quietly slipped away into exile or went into hiding. The Spanish authorities, for the moment, congratulated themselves. They believed that by making an example so appalling, they had cowed the Dutch into obedience. The psychological impact of using living creatures to consume a man from within was unlike anything people had seen. It was a new low in the annals of cruelty. However, if the Duke of Alba hoped to permanently break the Dutch will, he gravely miscalculated. In the longer run, these atrocities served to harden the resolve of the Dutch resistance. Outrage followed on the heels of fear. William of Orange and other rebel leaders seized on stories like Pieter's to illustrate the inhuman tyranny of Spanish rule. Pamphlets and engravings began to circulate, often anonymously, depicting Spanish soldiers as demonic figures committing heinous acts. One particularly dramatic engraving showed the Duke of Alba himself presiding over a scene of torture. In the background, men and women were being roasted, broken, and, yes, attacked by rats, all under the banner of the Inquisition. Such images were propaganda, but they were rooted in the very real events people experienced. They inflamed anger against Alba the Butcher and strengthened the Dutch desire for vengeance and freedom. Even some moderate Dutch Catholics, who might have remained loyal to the king, were disgusted by the bloodshed. Alba's cruelty was uniting people of different faiths against him. The Spanish tactics were creating martyrs out of rebels. Pieter's name, though lost to official history, lived on in local lore as a kind of martyr, a victim of unspeakable injustice. In hushed voices, neighbors would say, "Remember Pieter the blacksmith. Remember what they did to him. We must never let that happen again." His horrible death became a rallying point. It proved that there could be no compromise with a regime that would literally feed men to rats. The only option was to fight on, if not for oneself, then for the memory of those tortured souls and for the safety of one's children. Indeed, Alba's reign of terror ultimately backfired. Far from pacifying the Netherlands, it fueled a deeper rebellion. The year after Pieter's execution, 1573, saw Alba bogged down in bloody sieges and failing to crush the revolt. In towns like Haarlem and Alkmaar, Dutch defenders fought with furious determination, preferring to flood their own land or starve rather than surrender to Alba's mercies. They knew what surrender might mean. They had heard of Zutphen, Naarden, and the rats in the dungeon. This grim resolve surprised the Spanish. The Duke of Alba himself grew bitter and weary. He reportedly admitted defeat in private, saying, "God and mankind are against me." By late 1573, King Philip II, frustrated with the endless rebellion and the bad reputation Alba's cruelty had earned across Europe, recalled the Duke to Spain. The Iron Duke left the Netherlands in disgrace, more hated than any man alive, as one contemporary put it. Of course, the war did not end there. It would rage on for decades under new commanders, but Alba's chapter, the bloodiest opening act of the 80 Years' War, taught a clear lesson. Brutal repression can sometimes stiffen the very resistance it seeks to crush. The Dutch Revolt would eventually lead to an independent Netherlands, a feat achieved not just by battles, but by enduring terrible sacrifices. And the story of Pieter and those Dutch rebels who met such ghastly ends would be remembered as proof of the cruelty they overcame. We today can reflect on how fortunate we are not to witness such things in person. But these events are a reminder that our history contains truly dark chapters. The things people have done to each other in the name of religion, empire, or power can be as terrifying as any nightmare. Yet, from those dark times, we also inherit stories of astonishing resilience. The Dutch did not give up. If anything, the greater the cruelty, the greater grew their determination that no future generation should have to endure the same. In a sense, every torture and execution steeled the Dutch spirit more, until finally they won their freedom. There is a grim lesson in Pieter's tale that echoes even today. When justice dies, when cruelty rules, ordinary people can become either victims or heroes, sometimes both. His story, though ghastly, asks us to consider our own values. It asks, what would you stand for even if fear clawed at your stomach? Would you have the courage to stand up to monstrous cruelty, knowing it could mean a monstrous end? These are uncomfortable questions. But history, especially dark history, compels us to face them. Thank you for witnessing this dark and difficult story all the way through. If this story chilled you, imagine living through it. What would you do when faced with such evil? Share your thoughts below. How do we reconcile the depths of human cruelty with the bravery of those who stood against it? Next week, we'll explore another grim chapter of history. Hit subscribe and ring the bell for more tales from history's dark side. Until then, thank you for watching.